He couldn't remember what grass felt like. Not the color of it, not the smell of it, just that it had existed. Once, in a life that no longer seemed real. His name was Thomas Doyle. He was 22 years old. He was a baker's apprentice from County Cork, Ireland, who once burned a loaf of sourdough and laughed about it for a week. By the winter of 1917, he had been living in a hole in the ground for 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days. Not a bunker, not a fortified shelter. A trench, 6 feet deep, 4 feet wide, dug out of Belgian clay with bare hands and broken shovels, held together by wooden boards and prayers. A place where men slept, standing up because the floor was submerged in water. Where rats the size of house cats ate the faces off the dead at night. And yet, Thomas Doyle woke up every single morning and did something remarkable. He had a routine. And that routine, the mundane, almost absurd rituals of daily life inside the most lethal strip of earth in human history, is what this story is really about. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about World War I. The war wasn't always loud. Most of it was waiting. And waiting, it turns out, can destroy a man just as efficiently as a bullet. Act 2. Why this matters, 700 kilometers. The length of the Western Front, a continuous scar of trenches stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border, housing over 3 million men at its peak. When the war began in 1914, everyone, the generals, the politicians, the boys enlisting in Manchester and Melbourne and Montreal, believed it would be over by Christmas. A quick, honorable clash of armies. Back home before the snow fell. They were wrong in a way that history rarely produces. Within months, the Western Front had calcified into a stalemate. Neither side could advance, neither side would retreat. So they dug. They dug down into the earth like animals. Not out of strategy, but out of survival instinct. And the war that was supposed to last weeks lasted 4 years, 3 months, and 2 weeks. For men like Thomas Doyle, this wasn't a deployment. It was an address. The trench was where they lived. It was where they slept, ate, argued, laughed, wept, and, for hundreds of thousands of them, where they died. So what did a day actually look like? Not in the history books, not in the general's reports. In the body, in the stomach, in the small, strange minutes of a man trying to stay human in a place designed to strip that away. Act 3, the investigation. 4:30 a.m. before dawn. The most dangerous moment of any soldier's day. It was called Stand To. Every morning, without exception, every soldier in every trench on the Western Front climbed to the fire step, a raised ledge cut into the trench wall, fixed his bayonet, and faced the enemy line. Silent, waiting. This was when attacks happened. Dawn. The gray light that makes shapes out of shadows. Snipers on both sides were already watching. Thomas stood there, boots soaking through, arms trembling not from fear alone, but from the cold that had lived inside his bones since October. He stared into no man's land, that harrowing stretch of churned corpse-strewn earth between the 2 trench lines. Sometimes it was 30 yards wide, sometimes 500. It didn't matter. It might as well have been the surface of the moon. Stand To lasted 30 minutes. Then came the command, stand down. And the morning's first ritual could begin. Rum. Every British soldier was issued a daily rum ration, a small tin measure of dark, almost syrupy spirit. For many men, this was the most anticipated moment of the entire day. Not because they were drunks, because it was warm, because it was consistent, because in a world that had stopped making any logical sense, the rum ration arrived on schedule. Every single morning, like a small proof that somewhere in the universe, systems still functioned. After rum came inspection. Officers walked the line looking for trench foot, a horrifying condition caused by standing in cold water for days on end. The flesh would turn numb, then red, then gray. Left untreated, it required amputation. The Army's solution was almost comically inadequate. Keep your feet dry. In a trench half filled with mud and water. In northern France, in November. Thomas had learned the trick early. Goose fat, rubbed in every morning. He traded a pack of cigarettes for a small jar of it from a French farmer near Ypres. It was one of the smartest transactions of his life. By 7 a.m., if no bombardment came, the real enemy arrived. Boredom. This is the part of WWI that never makes the movies. The crushing, relentless, spirit-dissolving tedium of the hours between stand 2 and stand 2. The waiting. Men played cards. They deloused their uniforms, picking lice from the seams, one by one, burning them with candle flames. They read letters from home, sometimes 10 or 15 times, until the paper fell apart along its folds. They drew in small notebooks. They argued about football. They carved their names and hometowns into the wooden boards of the trench walls, an act that felt both pointless and desperately important. Thomas wrote letters every day, whether he had anything to say or not. To his mother, to his sister, to a girl named Margaret who worked in the post office and had smiled at him once in a way that he'd been thinking about for 3 years. He never sent most of them. They were too honest. He kept them folded inside his breast pocket, over his heart, a habit he would later say was the only reason he didn't lose his mind. 12 pounds. The weight of equipment a British infantryman carried at the Battle of the Somme. On average, they were expected to walk, not run, across no man's land toward the enemy machine guns. Meals came twice a day when supply lines held. Bully beef, tinned gray, faintly metallic, hard biscuits that could chip teeth. Sometimes bread, delivered in sandbags and tasting of everything those sandbags had absorbed. On good days, stew, a brown, indistinguishable liquid that could contain anything and was somehow still a reason for morale. Thomas was a baker. He thought about bread every day. Not in a romantic way, in a technical, tormenting way. He would calculate hydration ratios in his head, plan loaves he would bake when he got home, invent new recipes. It was his private act of defiance. A mind that plans for the future is a mind that refuses to accept there might not be one. Act 4. The complication. Here is the thing that will haunt you about Thomas Doyle's story. In December 1914, his first winter, something happened along the Western Front that military historians still struggle to fully explain. On Christmas Eve, German soldiers began lighting candles along their trench parapets, then singing, Stille Nacht, Silent Night, and the British soldiers, without any order from any officer, stopped shooting. Men climbed out of their trenches into no man's land. The same territory that 12 hours before had been the most lethal ground on Earth. They shook hands with the men who had been trying to kill them. They exchanged cigarettes and buttons and photographs. They played football, or something that resembled it, in the mud between the wire. Thomas Doyle was there. He shook the hand of a German soldier named Friedrich, who showed him a photograph of his wife and baby daughter in Munich. Friedrich spoke no English. Thomas spoke no German. They stood together for perhaps 4 minutes in the cold, looking at a photograph of a woman neither of them would ever see again, and somehow understood each other completely. By Boxing Day, the truce was over. The war resumed. Orders from above, threats of court-martial, the impossible logic of it all reasserting itself. Within weeks, the same men who had shaken hands were firing at each other again. This is the contradiction at the dark heart of World War I. It was not fought by monsters. It was fought by men who could recognize each other as human beings and then continued anyway. The real enemy was never Friedrich. It was the system, the machine of empire and miscalculation and national pride that had swallowed millions of young men and refused to spit them back out. The trench was where the math of that machine was made flesh. Act 5, the final takeaway, Christmas Truce of 1914. Thomas Doyle survived the war. He was discharged in March 1919. He returned to County Cork, opened a small bakery on Patrick Street, and reportedly made the finest sourdough in Munster for the next 40 years. He never spoke publicly about the war. His letters, all of them, even the unsent ones, were discovered in a trunk by his granddaughter in 1987. They were donated to the Imperial War Museum in London, where they remain today. The one addressed to Margaret, the post office girl, was 47 pages long. She had married someone else in 1916, not knowing if Thomas was alive. He never married. The trench took 4 years of his life. But it took more than that. It took the version of himself that had existed before he climbed down into the mud, and it never gave that version back. This is the story we don't tell enough about the First World War. Not the tactics, not the territorial gains measured in yards of mud. The human cost? Measured not just in deaths, though there were 20 million of those, but in the small, irreplaceable losses. The loaves of bread not baked, the letters not sent, the hands that shook in no man's land and then reached for their rifles, the men who came home but were never really home again. Thomas Doyle's story is one of millions. Every trench on the Western Front held its own universe of small human moments, and most of them were never written down. Next week, we're going to look at the other side of the wire. What daily life looked like for a German soldier in the exact same war. The similarities will disturb you more than the differences. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to understand what the war to end all wars actually cost. Not in maps, but in men. Subscribe. Share. Remember,